Hi there, this is Ant here, and I'm just here to do a very quick screencast to recap what we looked at in week one of MC410. So what we're going to look at today very quickly is setting up a new session, which parameters we should be using, and also the structure of the Pro Tools session as well. Okay, so this is the quick start menu, which you would normally see when you start Pro Tools. As you can see, there's this option here, which is normally ticked, which means that whenever you start Pro Tools, you'll see this window. If you're already in Pro Tools and you choose File, New Session there, which obviously is greyed out at the moment, you'll get a very similar window, just basically without this banner on the top of it. Okay, so everything we're looking at here will apply there too. And so our options here are we can create a session from a template. This isn't something that I often use, but for some people this can be quite useful. There are a bunch of categories here for different kind of sessions. Some of these will, all, like songwriter for example, will already have instruments in place on tracks. You notice here there are names of projects that I've worked on, and you can save your own templates. So if you're going to be recording an album with somebody or doing a lot of sessions which are going to require a similar setup, then you can use the template system for that, and it can really help and really save a lot of time. But for what we're doing in this module, we are almost always going to be using create blank session, open recent session, or open session. Okay, so with create blank session, it will create a blank session using the parameters below, which we'll come to in a second. Okay. Open recent session, if we click on that, it will give us a list of sessions that have been opened recently. And then open session, basically when we use that, if we click OK, that will just take us into the Finder so we can find a session to open. So let's go back to create blank session, which is the one that we're going to be using. Now we can see here session parameters. Okay, now if you're not seeing it, it'll be because that's tucked up like that little triangle there. Just make sure that's dropped down. Audio file type, I always work in broadcast WAV. Okay, it's just .wav, but it's called BWF, broadcast wave format. All that means is it has timecode embedded in it. That's not really going to impact on us, but it's worth getting into the habit of always using that, because that can save you a lot of trouble further down the line. The bit depth, I will almost always work in 24-bit bit depth. This is the bit depth or the word length of the audio. Really, you always want to work in 24-bit. 16-bit will do you fine. 16-bit is the word length for CD quality audio. 32-bit float is a new format that Pro Tools can use, and that can offer some protection against clipping and stuff like that, but it also places a greater stress on the CPU and creates bigger files. 24-bit is still the best option, I believe. And this box here, interleaved, this is a new Pro Tools 10 feature. This basically, if you tick this box, Pro Tools will use actual stereo audio files in the session, and if you make stereo tracks, it will create stereo audio files. Traditionally, Pro Tools, whenever you put stereo audio into it, it splits it into two mono files. I personally just leave this as it is, because I'm used to working that way with Pro Tools, so I'll just leave that unticked. Okay. The sample rate, I would normally only ever use 44.1 kilohertz. Occasionally, if I was doing something for TV or video, I would use 48 kilohertz. But the sample rate, really, almost always we're going to use 44.1. And then this area, this is quite important, the I/O settings. This is basically the setup you want to use for all your inputs and outputs and your buses. Now, something that people can trip over on sometimes is that when you first start Pro Tools, it will default to last used, and that just means whatever the last session was that was opened, it will use those I/O settings. Now, obviously, if you or somebody else has used the machine with a session that was recorded somewhere else, which has very different I/O settings, that can get you in a bit of a mess. Okay, so my advice is always choose the correct I/O settings. Now, when we're working in G125 and G127, that's the suite with all the iMacs in it, you would almost always select stereo mix. Okay, so that just gives you a basic stereo mix. When we're working in other studios in the university, there are I/O setups that have been named and they've been created by me, so that all of the inputs and outputs are already there and they're already labeled. Okay, so and they all have the name of the studio and usually a date afterwards as well. So find the studio that you're in. Often in some of the studios we have surround set up, so there'll be stereo and also surround, and then just pick the one with the most recent date and you should be good to go. Okay, so that is our setup done. So I'm going to go OK here, and now this is giving us this is asking us what we want to call the session and where we want to save it. Okay, now when we're in G125, this is my laptop, but when we're in G125 and G127, obviously we do all of our work either on the temp drive or on our own hard drive that we bring with us. I'm just going to go into my audio drive here, and I'm going to find my screencast folder, and I'm just going to call this week, turn caps lock off, week 1 session setup. Okay, and then I go save, and there we go. So that's now created our blank session. Now, before we go any further, I just want us to quickly look at the structure of the session itself. So I'm just going to go and find the session in my audio drive here. Okay, so I'm going to switch to this view in the Finder. So if you look here, this is the session file itself. Okay, so this doesn't contain any audio or any MIDI or anything like that. It's just the file that tells Pro Tools where everything is in the session. The wave cache, that's just shortcuts for the waveforms of the audio in the session. We don't need to worry about that. That's just to save Pro Tools redrawing everything every time it loads up the session. If you have video in the session, that will go in this folder. If you create clip groups in your session, they will be in that folder. And then if you have audio files in your session, they will be in that folder. Okay, so you will notice that when we create the session, we just give it the name. We don't need to make a folder for the session. When we give it the name and hit return, hit OK, it makes the folder to go with the session, for the session to go inside. Okay, if you're doing a project where there are going to be lots of sessions inside it, maybe you would want to create a folder for that project, and then in that folder in Pro Tools you would give it the name for the song and it would create it for you. That's fine. But if you make the mistake of making a folder for the session and then putting the name in, you're just going to end up with folders within folders, if you see what I'm saying, and it could be a little bit harder to find stuff. Okay, so I think that wraps it up for us for today. So I'll be back very soon with another screencast where we're going to be making some simple beats using Boom and direct entry of notes. Okay, thanks.